Introducing Symbol, the most effective blockchain for business today. Symbol reduces friction in business, accelerating innovation and supercharging the creation, exchange and protection of all assets. Symbol is the secure, trusted value exchange platform for business, making it possible for enterprise and developers to create value together. Because together, everything is possible. Symbol, powering possibility. See how you can transform your business with Symbol at symbolplatform.com.
Thank you, panelists, for joining me here today. We are here to talk about some fascinating technological shifts happening here in Web3. Blockchain technology, as people know it, was invented with Bitcoin. Well, it's been about 10 years since Bitcoin came out, just a little bit more. And people are having more nuanced discussions. Joining me today are three experts on where the future is going and how this type of technology can be adopted in practical use cases, especially by enterprises and other types of, let's call it multipolar organizations that require some mix, as you'll see, of security with, well, a different type of security. So Antony, Konstantin, Andrius, I would love all of you to introduce yourselves. Antony, why don't we start with you, CCO at NEM?
Hi, nice to meet everyone, and thank you for hosting the panel. It's going to be a very exciting session, as you say. So I'm Antony Welfare. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at NEM Software. Recently joined the business. Previously, I've been spent most of my career in enterprise and retail, and the last few years sort of into blockchain via really Bitcoin. As David said, I understood Bitcoin, a few years ago. I got into the Ethereum world and then into enterprise.
Well, Antony, thank you for that introduction. We're going to be exploring your background quite a lot during this conversation because I love how you started in a pure decentralized world and then went straight corporate. So that's going to be a conversation about what the future looks like. Konstantin, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? You're running some of the, or much of, I should even say, the core infrastructure that powers Web3.
Yeah, hey, thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm Konstantin Richter. I'm the CEO and founder of Blockdaemon. Blockdaemon is an infrastructure services company in the blockchain space. We connect institutions to blockchains. And really what that means is that we consider ourselves a middleware platform. We provide different degrees of automation dependent on the degree of decentralization needed to major blockchain protocols.
Well, Konstantin, thank you for joining us. It's great to have your perspective on what actually makes things tick. Not to mention, you really do have a blend of that enterprise perspective, while at the same time truly understanding how this decentralized world is going to work. Andrius, tell us a little bit about your background and why you're here today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrius Bartminas. I am the co-founder and CEO of SuperHow. We're a private blockchain research and innovation lab based in Lithuania, Vilnius.
Excellent. Well, Andrius, thank you for joining us as well. Certainly, we've seen some interesting developments in the security token space, including just over the weekend here, where the SEC provided a no-action relief when it came to security tokens. So I guess let's start with some basic definitions. When someone says the term hybrid chain, that can actually mean a number of things. Konstantin, I believe you may have mentioned it earlier. Sometimes it's a proof of work chain with a proof of stake chain on top. That's one way. But that's not what we're talking about today, and that's not what we're talking about in the enterprise space. Antony, I think you're probably best positioned. Can you give us, in layman's terms, what is the quote-unquote hybrid chain?
Yeah, it's always interesting definitions with new technology, isn't it? And sort of where it fits. And I suppose my definitions will always be slanted to the enterprise world and where it makes more sense, the words. And it's interesting because I've just had a client call previously where there was a lot of confusion about hybrid and what it actually means. So my opinion is it's the mix, it's bringing together the best of both worlds from a public blockchain, so the likes of Bitcoin as the original, but Ethereum and many, many other sort of public blockchains, and the private side of it or permission side of it, where as an enterprise, you need to have high levels of security, high levels of access, know your customers, AML, all that, important regulation really, and from governments and different bodies. So it's bringing both together, and it allows a lot more business opportunities and opportunities for the world. If you bring together something that is public, where everybody can access it, and part of it is closed to a certain community, but you have a very strong link, like an inextricable link. So it is part of both. So for me, the best way I describe hybrid blockchain is as a supply chain. So a supply chain of a product, so something that you buy every day, be it, Coca-Cola or, a car or anything. Those products are made up of thousands of parts, thousands of different suppliers. And those people in the supply chain are not going to be able to have the power to host a node to manage what you would need for a pure private blockchain, a full-on permission private blockchain. So what you need is to have the public side of it, where it's just an access point to it. It uses all the important parts of blockchain, public blockchain, the cryptography. It's safe, secure, it's immutable. And that information can then go to the enterprise side of it, the private side of it, for them to be able to do what they need within their firewall and within their security. So it means that you get a lot more efficiency. You don't need everyone to host a node. Can you imagine if we all have to host nodes and manage nodes? I mean, most people don't even know what a node is. But we can't grow blockchain technology if everybody has to have a node and everybody has to manage that. So it's all about allowing access for both, best of both worlds. So you've got the secure enterprise and all their security, but you've also got the whole world that's out there, which has so much creativity and value. So that's the sort of way I would describe it for an enterprise focus.
Okay, thanks for that, Antony. So Konstantin, I heard a lot about running nodes there. Can you actually, and try to keep this brief and simple for, let's call it an enterprise audience. Is it hard to run a node if I'm, let's call it a Joe Schmo company?
Well, there's a lot in a statement like that, because first off, every blockchain speaks its own language, right? So it really varies what blockchain protocol you operate with. And then there's also a lot of different types of nodes, right? So it really depends on what you're doing. I think here, really what we're saying is we're talking about important nodes that secure the integrity and the function of a blockchain. Operating those is complex, just because it requires an ongoing engagement with the developer side of a project. Because if it's a true open source decentralized project, the evolution of software is non-linear, which means that if you have to operate nodes, it's not something you can just do, click a button once. You can if you hire a company like Blockdaemon, but the doing it yourself is relatively complicated. There's networks like Ethereum these days where keeping a node in sync that actually participates in the respective network actively is still a very hard challenge. And for some networks, it gets harder over time, mostly because, blockchains have certain idiosyncrasies. One of them is they get larger. And then, over time, blockchains have histories and scar tissue and forks, and, you got to index them correctly and all that type of stuff. So, running decentralized server infrastructure and being a part of a decentralized cog within a server infrastructure requires more work than normally, also because automation is a little more difficult. And so I'd say that at least for us at Blockdaemon, what we've found to be really fruitful waters is to provide enterprises with the stability and planability that they need and handle all the crazy somewhere else. So bridging those two components is very important.
So Konstantin, it's great that you're able to go and make really complex things simple for these enterprises. But Andrius, I've got to ask you, as we move on in this conversation, is there even a need for all the complexity? That is to say, do you want the public component of a hybrid chain? Is it something of value, have you found?
Yeah, actually, I would say the main benefit of the public chain is the trust. So when you need trust infrastructure, for any kind of process you want to make more trusted or trustful by the users or retail or something or your partners. So it means that you have to have the consensus, real consensus running that network. And the private networks, it's sometimes has lots of issues because it runs without the real consensus. It's a centralized consensus models, for example, in the Hyperledger or in the Corda. You have to trust the company still, being the user of such product or such I would say protocol. So yes, sometimes it's even urgent and crucial to use the public chains for those like critical components or processes that has to take the trust and to ensure that trust within the ecosystem as a code. So this is the cases most of all that will be using the public chains and leveraging the business models.
I think it's really interesting though, because the last few years talking about, Hyperledger and Corda as solutions, most of the client discussions and the complexity comes around who's going to be part of the group, the consortium, and who's going to manage the nodes.
Yeah.
And then you get to the point what Andrius just made, and they go, but isn't this just all centralized? Have we missed the total point of blockchain and decentralization and the trust aspect? Because all we're doing is basically using blockchain instead of a centralized database, which is more efficient in different ways. But actually, do we miss the whole trust and the public side of it? So I think it's really interesting how the tech has progressed over the last, definitely few months, if not year or so, to understand that side of it.
Catch up on this comment actually with such technology as a NEM symbol that is pure, I would say, pure blockchain protocol, but focusing on enterprise needs. You can achieve this trust by building the truly decentralized consortium networks. That means that you can have this trust infrastructure. Of course, still will be the question who will join that consortium and so on and so on. But once the consortium is already formed and you join the consortium, you can use this infrastructure as a trust layer between the consortium members. So this is the main point when I'm asking my clients, for example, what kind of infrastructure you need. The first thing is, do you need to solve your own problem? For example, like MySQL, they solve their own tracking problem, and then the permission blockchain is okay because you don't need to trust somebody, like to put the trust of yourself to somebody else, and because you're solving your own problem. But when you need to trust to solve the trust problem within the ecosystem as equal members, then those centralized protocols are not working. And
well, let's explore that. I think you bring something up that's quite relevant, which is, when is it so important to find trustless counterparties that a use case essentially exists that allows for all this tech to be built, for nodes to be operated, for IT to come in, for software developers to build solutions? What are those problem sets that you've encountered? Antony, I imagine you've encountered more than one or two of these. What are real life use cases where someone needs that type of, let's call it, the security that comes with a public chain consensus?
I think it probably, my background, I always talk supply chain and, product provenance and track and trace and things. So when you're working with that, the question I would always ask is any retailer and brand, do you trust your entire supply chain? I have asked that at a conference, and I was told by some of the biggest retailers in Europe, they do. It's impossible. Let's be realistic. These retailers and brands have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of suppliers. So it's not about trust, whether I like or trust you or not. It's about, do I trust your data? Okay, so I always say to people, don't think of trust as, do I trust Andrius? That's between me and Andrius. Do I trust the data that Andrius is sending me? That's the question. And so that's where it's important to have this trusted layer that's also efficient, because permission blockchains are very they're very complex and very inefficient. So you've got to do the balance between trust and efficiency for enterprise. So building a purely permission blockchain for a 500,000 supplier supply chain is never going to work. It's one of the first pieces of work I did, 5 years ago, where we looked at the supply chain of a global brand and a global retailer, and the tech guys in the room sat there and went, we're going to have to process billions of transactions. And there was shock, and everybody went, we can't ever do this. And you wouldn't do that. You don't need to have all that sort of private permission side of it for trust, because you use the actual network and the process of the public network, which is the trust, because you've got all these other nodes in the algorithm, most importantly, consensus algorithm of how you process the transactions and how you write them to blockchain. Then the information is immutable and usable. So it is, supply chain for me, physical supply chain is where you need the biggest balance, and where trust can be using the public blockchain and the nodes and how that consensus runs.
I want to explore that, and I want to explore consortia and other places where the quote unquote counterparties are sometimes competitors in an industry, but they're looking for a common solution. So I want to talk about that. But Konstantin, can we talk a little bit about what type of data here we're talking about? What is on-chain data? What is off-chain data? And do they ever overlap or link?
Well, yes and no. And it can be anything depending on really the protocol. So on-chain data, in its the most simple form, ideally there shouldn't be a lot of data on a blockchain, because the size of blockchain of the chain makes decentralization harder, right? And so one of the big challenges of blockchains in general is because ultimately it's an inefficient system when it comes to data storage. And so you want to keep data as simple as possible. And so in things like Bitcoin and stuff, on-chain data is ultimately it's transaction logs, and that's it. And so there isn't a lot of information there. And the way to think of it is one of the troubles I always have when we sell Bitcoin nodes and data APIs, for example, is that the question we get asked a lot is, hey, why can't you show data, for example, where transactions come from a location perspective? And you're kind of like, well, that's just not on chain. Like, that's just not part of what the blockchains or the Bitcoin protocol stores. And so I think that's maybe a good example here, where obviously more permission setups are important, because that might be for a supply chain that sounds like it's an important data point. So location, for example. So, just when you evaluate, so the Bitcoin blockchain, which obviously is obvious to us, is obviously not maybe a great tool to track supply chain data, because it misses key components of what that data is on chain. And then off chain, you can really run anything. It means that the blockchain periodically checks into a data source and connects something, right? And so these connectors and that physical process is very often what makes the difference between a permissioned network and a non-permissioned network. Mostly it's how do you sort of connect the blockchain component to a commercial component. And obviously enterprises have different needs. One of the things we see most actually at this point is even when it comes to software certifications around security, for example, there's certain requirements around how you touch data, how you connect to data. And so predefining those off-chain components and data sources, these sit in legacy data systems. And so, how to connect to those is really what makes it complex. But yeah, I think you want as little data on-chain as possible, considering, and you want as much throughput as possible on the blockchain, mostly. And so that's sort of kind of what you need to figure out. And so, yeah, it's a careful balance. And again, the beauty with blockchain ultimately is, and there's hundreds of derivatives of this. I always say blockchain actually really has three components, and we always think in buckets because we work with so many. And so there's a server component where the ledger lives, and whatever that log looks like. There's a consensus software component, which really dictates what the node does under a lot of different circumstances. So it says, hey, if you're not connected to X amount of peers or this and that, like what actually physically happens to me. And then there's connectors to peers. And you can specify all these three different things, like you can say, I want this really large, I want a consensus that mechanism that checks in every second or every 10 minutes, and when this happens, then the node does this. And I need a specific amount of connectors in order to be functional. And then they all tweak this based on a lot of different use cases. And so, but yeah, off-chain, on-chain is a nice example of where the two worlds meet of legacy systems and blockchain systems.
Well, that sounds like a complex decision to make if I'm, let's say, a project manager or an IT lead at a company and I'm trying to make some decisions. So Andrius, how do you guide clients when they come to you with a problem and you say, here's the ideal solution for you? How do you guide them? How do you kind of do the math on their behalf?
Yeah, so first of all, the most critical is to check the processes that the company is running and which processes we are willing to transfer to the blockchain. So what we are putting on the blockchain actually. So you can put whatever process you want actually, but not all the processes are meant to be transferred to the blockchain. For example, there is a big issue with the public chains that are running on a smart contract concept, and you need, for example, to develop really complex process into that smart contract that could also change during the time. For example, one of those is security tokens. How many of events could happen with a certain security? So inheritance, someone lost the keys. So, but you cannot lose the access to your securities. So all this complex processes behind that even certain people doesn't know that exist has to be programmed into the smart contract to work. And then actually, what you get, you get that this actually doesn't worth to do because it is too complex, too techy, I would say, and nobody will understand how to operate with those. And but actually, you need to think about what process do I need for users to trust on, and this is the mostly the processes or use cases that has to be transferred to the blockchain, and where the blockchain could help and leverage something in during that business model. So that's how we approach like our clients and how we consult them to choose the blockchain or what processes to transfer to the blockchain. That's our way.
That makes a lot of sense. So Antony, we've been hearing about NEM symbol for some time. To say it's highly anticipated might be an understatement. So tell me, why did you join the organization around this time? Why did you come here from these extraordinary enterprise corporations?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's really the journey that I've been on and that blockchain, enterprise blockchain is on. And so, go back sort of 5-6 years ago when I decided to go into enterprise blockchain, that for me was because I believe that blockchain can transform big business, governments, and the big things around us. So not just, decentralized world, but actually do something to try to move the lack of trust we have in our world. Let's be realistic. There's not much trust with governments, with big corporations, with, heaven forbid I say, social media companies and search companies. And we all know the names of, do we trust them? Not a lot anymore, And so do we need them or do we need what they provide? Yes. So that for me is really important. So I went in, I said to myself back in 2015, I want to work for the biggest blockchain company in the world. So in my head, I went blockchain, it's back-end systems, it's enterprise focus. It has to be Oracle. So in my head, Oracle was going to be the biggest blockchain company ever. So I went into Oracle, spent a couple of years there. Oracle's business model is is all about the legacy systems and all about maintaining, managing, hosting, and growing. Blockchain will be extremely important to Oracle in 5-10 years time. Once it becomes so big in enterprise that actually you need the scale of Oracle, etc. NEM and Symbol sort of came on my radar a few months ago, and it's like, wow, Symbol is going to be the one that's built that, and it's in one. It's not a public chain together with a private chain sort of ish merges. This is built as one, so it's public and private together as one. And that for me was like, wow, this is where we need to go, because this is what enterprises need. This is what the world needs, because you've got so much creativity in public as well. You need that to bring that together. So it was during that process that I got to know, obviously I knew NEM from historically, but hadn't really spent a lot of time because I was purely enterprise. And all of a sudden it made sense that this is the solution that I've spoken to hundreds of enterprise clients over the last 5 years. And I'm like, wow, this is now the solution to a lot of their issues. Yeah, there's some very specialist issues that will never be public blockchain at all, especially some of the regulated areas. But most other solutions, you sit there and go, this is the answer, because it's efficient, it's trusted, and it brings together more of what we need to. It's more along the decentralized route. At the end of the day, you've got to remember, enterprise is the ultimate centralized authority, especially a government, you know. So, but we do live in a centralized society. We all have numbers, be it a passport number, an ID number, an employee number. So, you know, to move on that route to a decentralized, more powered route, you do need to bring this together. And you look at some of the work done by, you know, mainly Ethereum and their private chain projects. They've brought together the private public, but they've built it in a way that doesn't really work. And Ethereum 2.0 in a number of years' time will achieve what we have achieved already, you know, with the Symbol platform, bringing it together. So that for me is the future is hybrid. And the important thing is it brings together small companies, entrepreneurs, micro businesses, together with the governments and the giant tech companies and the giants, you know, every other companies. It's going to bring it a lot more together, which is really exciting. And the potential of this is so much more together rather than separately.
Andrius, could this change the world?
Of course.
Good answer, Andrius.
Of course, and the world is changing, actually. And for example, there is circulating this European Commission proposal for accepting that the cryptocurrencies already exist, and like crypto assets are here. And there's like lots of things that 2 years before was even, you cannot like think about that. And today we have, for example, the same Bank of Lithuania digital collector's coin that you can transfer to the public NEM network. So it's there, and even the bank, the first idea of the bank was to do purely public chain asset, but because of some I would say requirements that are coming from the critical infrastructure perspective when you're dealing with the financial industries. So the architecture had to be adjusted, and the private network has to be built for that project. But still having the interaction and the function feature to transfer the assets, digital assets of the bank to the public network of NEM.
Well, that's a history-making move right there, and it did get a lot of great press, fortunately, too, showcasing how valuable a public network can be. Konstantin, you're talking enterprises too, and in the conversations you and I have had offline, we've talked about sometimes how complex it is for them to maintain their infrastructure. So can you give us a perspective on what it's like to be an enterprise company, an enterprise IT company, let's say the IT component within an enterprise company that's considering a blockchain solution? What are the types of things that they're exploring? What are the headaches that you and, let's say, other companies, and on the software side, some of the blockchain protocols are helping them overcome?
I think there's a lot there. I think the one of the big challenges still in the space is that the people who are seriously considering, so in enterprises, you have a lot of different constituents. the guys who actually have to make actual systems work probably dread blockchain, right? So there's the guys who have to hold together complex ERP systems and SAP systems, like SAP, where everyone is onboarded, and you go to them and tell them, hey, we want to try some blockchain stuff. They're probably going to fall off the chair. And so it's interesting who the constituents are. I mean, from our perspective, most of the time when we've worked with enterprises, it's sort of driven out of innovation groups who are experimenting within certain loops and then expand that over time, right? And so I think very similar to progressive decentralization on the public side, in an enterprise, you need progressive politicization internally to extend the groups and give people trust, right? Which is what really needs to happen internally. And so the problem with enterprises specifically is can we trust the software not to do anything malicious? How do we connect to open source systems in general? And then there's the general, even vendor security audits and stuff that companies like us have to go through when really what we do is we provide permission node networks. We don't care about the protocol for enterprises where they can set permissions and access points and have an interface and can click start nodes, turn off nodes, run them in any different data centers and invite outside participants to it. And so from our perspective, that's been progressive. It's been relatively slow. Most of the concerns are all around security and access points. And then I think and then normally it's a closed POC that starts with an enterprise internally and then very slowly gets opened up to like maybe 1, 2, or 3 network participants, and then they see how that goes. And then it goes, larger than that. But I'd say it's a bumpy road. I mean, for sure, because enterprise systems are just complicated, and there's a lot of legal and systematic licensing also that needs to be put in place. There's no transparency also within the blockchain ecosystem that makes this easy for an enterprise to connect with. Because as an enterprise, if you go, I want to work on blockchain, let me go to blockchain.com, you're talking, oh, there's a wallet here, what's this? Like, where do you even go to find out what the true state of play is, what blockchain does what? And so we try to sort of direct some of that attention. But I think we're still very, very early for sure. But I think standard licensing, for example, like ISO compliance, like you can't search, there's no way you could search for like, hey, who are the ISO compliant infrastructure providers in blockchain? Like who actually has the basic certifications we need from a legal perspective in order to connect to systems?
That's not even a technical problem. That's almost like a contractual prerequisite.
Absolutely. Like for any large scale enterprise has clear certification requirements that they have on technical providers.
And they have those for good reason, right? They have a duty to their shareholders. They have corporate governance concerns that are a lot more complex than a startup. And I've got to tell you, having worked with more than 200 companies within this industry, a lot of them are novel, right? If blockchain itself is only 10 years old, as we discussed at the advent of this call, how many companies could have existed for 12 years? Not many is the answer.
And there's one thing that I think is important in that context, which is because we come a little bit out of a hacky, disruptive space, the biggest risk points are always internal. Right. And so it's not the software that's going to be the problem, but like an ISO certification requires us to background check employees, for example, which seems pretty logical in our world, but is not logical in a crypto-driven environment. And so it's actually, as an enterprise, if I open my doors to a blockchain project, how can I ensure that the people who participate in it, aren't, don't like criminals, for example, like anything that would impact my liability as a company. And so there are surprisingly few companies that are, for example, registered in the US, because a lot of the companies that got started in blockchain, for example, if you did a token sale or an ICO, a lot of the times they evaded incorporation in the US, for example. And then, so kind of how do you really track who's part of these things? How do you audit these things? And so ISO compliance for us was really interesting because we had to background check everyone who works for us. And we have people in Brazil and the Ukraine and we're a decentralized software company. And so it started to get really interesting. It's like, how can we assure enterprises that we provide a rigorous standard when it comes to our own staff, as well as how we access code, who has access to what at what point in time, what are the disaster recovery modules, all those type of things.
Well, Konstantin, thank you. So Symbol is an enormous achievement, a technical achievement with a lot of people putting in a lot of time. And there's a reason, Andrius, why you've decided to partner with this organization. And I want to go and get your perspective on why in just a moment. But tell me, what's it like working with the central bank?
It's tough, actually. Tough because, first of all, enterprise and central banks, of course, doesn't understand such kind of like a pure open source where you have a changing roadmap without any hard deadlines and the project is live, like everybody's developing and et cetera, and the bank has a certain schedule to do certain things, and you're like you're building the infrastructure, blockchain, private blockchain infrastructure for them, and you have to catch up with everything what's happened on NEM side with the developers. You have one version that works, then there's another version, you have to update, catch up, and et cetera, and you're doing a production grade product, actually. So this is like you have to navigate through all those requirements, all the security requirements, as already was said by Konstantin. And for example, even doing the infrastructure, like deployment of infrastructure at the production grade. Imagine that you have like to build the engine of your car, sitting on the back of your car, on the back seat of your car, and you have a tool like that connects to another tool, and you're putting everything like in a very small like open hole. So it's like that's what we experienced actually when you're connecting to the guys who works at the bank desktop computer. That computer is connected to the infrastructure, and that's everything. Like everything is under the full surveillance all the time. So yeah, lots of things actually, and lots of things learned. Lots of things learned that you cannot do certain things that is available, for example, on the blockchain, pure blockchain. So you cannot leave the REST API open for anybody to go and search and dive deep into the infrastructure of the private infrastructure. But still, you have, for example, the keys that are at the end user side, and somehow that transaction that user signed on his computer has to be announced on the network. So this is like you have somehow to interact with this REST server. So it's a long story. I could tell you a lot of stories like what we had during this period, but yeah, everything is doable, everything is manageable. You have to look at it in a serious way, because yeah, it's a serious business. It's enterprise.
Well, precision remote surgery sounds complicated.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
You did speak a little bit about interoperability, but before we talk about that, and I do want to speak about that because that's one thing that Symbol is certainly embracing. Let's talk about kind of your experience in actually partnering with the team at NEM on LB Coin. What was that like? And then what was it like in terms of partnering with their software, that is to say, of using their protocol?
Yeah, so we had the experience working with a Hyperledger, for example, Fabric guys. Yeah, you're one of big projects, I would say, because there is like trend in the market to go with Corda or Hyperledger. I don't know why it's happening like that, but it's maybe because my neighbor did on that and I am doing the same. So it's a bad example to go for industry, I would say, because you're limited to certain technologies that are better, that are more efficient and more to that use case like that you're doing. But yeah, working with the NEM team was a great experience, I would say. Yeah, good support, timely communications, and everything in spot. Of course, at the beginning, it was like a little bit cranky, and because the guys hadn't. I understand fully, because you have your own agenda, you have to public network to launch, and everything is focused on their job. And we are just one of the projects that is using the technology. But still, the focus that we got from the NEM, I'd say it was brilliant, and we are satisfied. And now more and more projects is coming to our partnership, I would say, and we're happy working.
It's also, back to your question you asked me earlier, David, that's part of the transition of where we are now, and what the guys have done previously is, one of the things that I'm looking after is our partners and our ecosystem, who are without question one of the most important parts of the future. So, with Andrius and our other sort of SI partners and other partners, be it consulting partners, we're very much bringing them all together now.
Well, Antony, you mentioned some fascinating trends, let's call it, in the space. And Konstantin, I'd love your perspective. As you're now speaking with an increasingly sophisticated client set of your own, what are you spotting as the newest trends? Are you seeing examples that would showcase that hybrid chains just might be more and more popular over time?
So I think one thing I want to say, just to get us there, is there's also, there's the part on the enterprises needing to understand bits. And then on the blockchain side, I think there's been a real absence of enterprise know-how as well, because the way you engage with enterprise, the way blockchain companies used to hit up enterprises was kind of like, we've got this super complex, weird thing that might add value to you. You should really do it because it's the next generation of whatnot. And not having an understanding on how difficult that actually is to implement for an enterprise. And so I think it took a long time for folks to get professional around really understanding their problems, approaching them with something that's easy and plug and play, yet adheres to everything they need. So they have a more immediate benefit than they've done in the past. And I think that's part of this story in terms of hybrid, right? It's like, can you approach enterprises with a subset of systems that's geared towards solving an actual problem they have today, so you can get activated, right? And so I think that's really, I think hybrid systems are more about communicating understanding than anything else to enterprises initially, because it's just so difficult to start. And don't forget that in the last 5 years, most enterprises, these projects started because a CEO read an article in The Economist somewhere about blockchain, and then hit up a CTO who hit up a guy who hit up a guy who suddenly stood there and was like, okay, now I gotta, find a blockchain that I can present, that we use, that does something. So I think the motivation from enterprises was always kind of there. It just was really, really hard to get anything meaningful done. And so, but obviously, and I think that was alluded to, that's the sort of challenge. You kind of want to make it hybrid and simple for an enterprise, but you also have to retain the underlying complexity, because if you can't trust the chain, if there aren't systems in place that allow for trustability, then blockchains quickly disqualify themselves, right? And so if you can't somewhere find out how to introduce immutable trust into the system via a degree of acceptable decentralization, then you can use a MySQL distributed database landscape. So it's complex, but I think we're getting better at it. Tools evolve. Blockchain projects like NEM, for example, are a good example when you kind of sort of progress towards a more immediate understanding of what enterprises really need. I think it's always going to be hybrid. There's just no way an enterprise will engage in a total open public network. I'd say that's an impossibility on any serious level at this moment, kind of just with where we are. And so if you want enterprise engagement, you need to have some checks and balances in place.
The other place as well to help enterprise, and it was a bit of a eureka moment probably about 2 years ago, where I sell the dream of blockchain, it's going to change the world, and Andrius agrees, so that's good. And you do all that bit, and then you're sat in front of the CTO, and they have a problem with this one subsidiary and these 1,000 transactions a day. That's it, right? What's the point of me trying to sell this entire amazing solution? His only issue this week is this. It's the tiniest solution. So fix that. Show how the simplest thing can fix that problem. Because then he comes back and you fix this problem, and then this, and then this. And the other thing to remember, an enterprise is the biggest group of unconnected and untrusted parties. Take any group, there's a group company and hundreds, if not thousands of entities, and each entity has a different ERP system. Each entity has different priorities. Each entity has different bank accounts. Each entity has their own world, even though they're all owned by the same company as such, the same group. So one of the piece of work that I did a long time ago with a consultancy was looking at 80% of transactions globally are within the enterprise. You don't even need to look outside your own walls. So if the CFO and the CEO and the CTO of the group say do this, we can all do it. Take ERP systems. ERPs are complex. What they actually do is very simple. You know, it's maintaining and verifying financial transactions. It's all it is recording it. But what Oracle and SAP and Workday have done is done 100 different iterations and 1 million different bespoke, you know, sort of implementations. So even if you're a pure SAP or Oracle house, your ERP is different. There's at least 100 different ones. And guess what? They don't talk to each other properly. And you want to transfer basic bank account information or banking balances, say, from Italy to the UK, you've got a whole reconciliation team. So we worked with a European bank who had 300 people in their bank reconciliation team. 300 people doing a job that shouldn't exist because the system should just talk to each other and verify it. So why not use blockchain as the information messenger in between? So the transactions get written to blockchain, you agree them, and then they get written to the other ERP. Done. No need for reconciliation. Yeah, you can still do an audit. It's a different part. So part of the work is to think within your enterprise and imagine a government. I mean, come on, we all know governments are completely disconnected with different departments doing different things who have no idea. I'm in the UK, and let's not talk about our track and trace app for COVID, which doesn't connect to the NHS system, but it's an
At least you have one.
Well, it's not of any use because the great thing is it's been launched the second time and it doesn't connect to the NHS system, but it's the NHS one. And that's, for me, is really the, you know, I know it's a political discussion but it's a great example of how an enterprise like a government or company is so disconnected, and actually just using some basic blockchain technology, not even some of the cool stuff it can do, just basic transfer of information that's trusted and immutable would add so much value. So it's a really interesting way that everybody thinks it's big and complex and going to take years. No. Fix the small problems first. As Konstantin said, there's a few real issues they have today. Yeah, there's a few more tomorrow and the day after. Fix those, and then you can start to grow naturally with the, you know, the enterprise or the system.
Andrius, I'm going to finish off our conversation with a question to you. What percentage of major enterprises are going to be actually using blockchain in a production part of their tech stack in the next 5 years?
It's a difficult question, actually. Yeah, but I think the market actually pushes towards it, actually. Because when the companies will understand that, for example, the blockchain or a consortium blockchain or a hybrid blockchain, you can actually use to solve the trust issues between each other. This will be actually the very powerful tool to interact between each other. For example, very simple solution for telecom industry, telecom companies that are doing this roaming settlement, for example. So you have to trust another telecom company that is outside of your country to settle the roaming agreement between you. So there is a settlement companies that ensures that this process works. So why do you have those settlement companies? You can do it purely on a technology basis and solve the trust issues between you. So I think those and many more features that blockchain comes with actually will push those companies towards the blockchain one way or another. Of course, in some industries, it will come much easier and much faster, as for example, finances industry, because that's why the blockchain was invented, as a digital cash, as a mean of value transfer, and this is what the finances is for. So solution is just straightforward, like viable to this kind of businesses. And of course, it has issues because high enterprise requirements, security, like I also already mentioned, the critical infrastructure. That is, for example, you cannot have a critical infrastructure as a public blockchain because there's lots of regulations that are saying that the company has to be an operator of such systems. So yeah, but industry is changing and technology is evolving very fast. Lots of new protocols coming.
So if you had to throw a number, Andrius, what percentage?
95.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's an optimistic number, but I think with the progress we've seen in the last few months, let alone last few years alone,
it's the same as question: how many of companies will be using TCP/IP protocol, for example, and the internet and HTML, and then lots of those protocols that are currently like hundreds of percents used by the companies, the users, the people, and they even don't know that they're using it. And the blockchain is the same. This is the technology that is running behind. You, in some cases, you didn't even need to know that this is running on a blockchain because it solves the different problems.
I asked this question, so I wrote Commercializing Blockchain, the book, last year, and I've got 13 contributors globally from around the world, some big experts. And I asked that question, I said, what does blockchain look like in 5 years? And nearly everyone said, you'll never talk about it. It will just happen. And it's exactly as Andrius says, we will be working behind the scenes doing blockchain, but nobody will know. It will just be a normal part of everybody's life, everybody's business.
Well, what a world that'll be. Thank you to the panelists for this enlightening conversation on hybrid chains and on enterprise adoption. Thanks, everyone.